Welcome to part 2 of our FOG Napoleonics intro series, and in this episode we'll focus on setting up a points-based game. Let's get into it. So there are 13 steps in setting up a game. Sounds daunting, but actually you should run through this pretty quickly within 20 to 30 minutes, including full setup, and I'll talk through each of these steps now. So the first thing simply is to dice for the region that you fight in. Each army list in our accompanying army list books has a region where that army historically fought. In this step, each player rolls one dice, and whoever has the higher number gets to choose which region to fight in, which has to be one of the regions from either your list or your opponent's list. Second step is you dice to block enemy strategies. I'll talk through the strategies in the next step, but basically this is your chance to stop your opponent taking their favorite strategy. Your ability to do this is dependent on the quality of your commander-in-chief, your core commander. So the first thing is you roll a number of dice. If you've got a competent commander, you roll 2 dice. If you've got a skilled commander, 4 dice. And an exceptional commander gets to roll 6 dice. And then with those dice, they can choose to block 1, 2, or 3 enemy strategies, again depending on the level of commander. So competent can block 1 of the 2 dice that you rolled, 1 strategy. Skilled can block 2 from the 4 dice that you rolled. An exceptional commander can block 3 of the 6 dice that you rolled. Then it comes to choosing strategies. Now every strategy has some pros and cons to it, and I'll talk through how the strategies work through the lens of those advantages and disadvantages. And remember, you can only choose one of the strategies that your opponent didn't block in the previous step. So positional defense is the most defensive of the strategies. The advantages of this is that you're allowed to place a large hill in your deployment area. You can add 1 to move your opponent's terrain, so you kind of get the terrain that you like a little bit more likely to. And you can use reverse slope and strong point, which is basically hidden deployment, and strong point we'll talk a bit more about later. The disadvantages of this is that you need to deploy all your visible troops before your opponent deploys anything. So your army goes down first, and you are constrained that you cannot move out of your deployment zone for the first 2 turns. So kind of stuck in your position a little bit. Flexible defense is slightly less defensive. The advantages of this is that you get to keep one division off table in reserve. And then the other thing is you can still use reverse slope and strong point. The disadvantages here is again movement constraint, although only for 1 turn, that you can't move out of your deployment area. The third one is probe. So this is an army that has sent out scouts and sniffed out where the enemy is. Chances are it's your advance guard that's discovered the enemy. So you kind of know a lot about where they are. So to represent this, the opponent deploys their whole army before you deploy any units. The opponent cannot use reverse slope. You know where they are. And if the opponent is flank marching, they have to tell you how many divisions and where those divisions will arrive. Not the composition of the divisions, just that they are coming. The disadvantage, as I said, you've probably got your advance guard out there. 2 of your divisions are actually off table. So 1 is a reserve and 1 is a reinforcement. So your army will feel a little bit vulnerable at first, but at least you know where your opponent is or where they're going to be. The fourth strategy is envelopment, and as it says, this is the only one you can flank march with. So the advantages are you can have at least 1 division on flank march, and 1 must be on table. So what that means is you can, by implication, have up to 3 divisions flank marching, and only 1 on table, or vice versa. Keeps your opponent guessing. The disadvantage is obviously that uncertainty of when the flank march might arrive. The fifth one is prepared attack. So this is softening up the enemy before the battle starts, so that pre-bombardment. To represent this, you can deploy artillery up to the halfway line, and they get, depending on what strategy your opponent chooses, 1 to 3 rounds of fire before the first turn actually starts. So it can really soften up a part of the enemy line. The disadvantage is you can't make a double move in your first turn. And then finally, the most aggressive of the strategies is frontal assault. This is where you get to make a free double move in your first turn, so you're really jumping at your opponent quite quickly, hopefully catching them out of position, catching them before their reserves arrive, or trying to reset their deployment. The disadvantages are that you have to subtract 1 when trying to move opponents' terrain, so they're likely to have more of the terrain they like, and also you must start deploying your divisions first. Normally the attacker deploys second in the sequence. In this one you have to deploy first, unless your opponent chose number 1, positional defense. So those are the 6 strategies. As you can see, it means that there can be a combination of up to 36 different starts to a game. Every game is going to be slightly different, which is makes it a lot of fun. Then we establish who attacks. So the general rule is the player with the higher numbered strategy is the attacker. So if I take 6 and you take 5, I'm the attacker because I've got the higher number. Occasionally, or quite often, you'll both choose the same strategy. So the way you resolve that is you then simply roll a dice, you add the level of your corps commander, and the player with the highest score can then choose whether to attack or defend. Then to decide how it all works from a deployment point of view, if you both chose positional defense, it's the defender who has to deploy his on-table troops first. If both players chose probe, it's the attacker who will deploy his on-table troops first. And if both players chose frontal assault, the attacker will deploy his on-table troops first. Now we get on to putting the terrain down. And this table you can find in the rules, and it gives you the options of which region you're fighting in, and then shows you for that region the types of terrain features that you can choose. And the numbers on the table will show you, firstly, the number in brackets is the compulsory pieces. So every region has 4 compulsory pieces. If you run across there, Southern Europe has got 1 steep hill as compulsory, 1 road, 1 difficult, and 1 rough as compulsory. The number next to the number in brackets is the total number of that piece that is allowed on the table. So we get into placing this. How does that work? So this diagram shows you a typical 6x4 foot table which you would use for 15mm figures. The first thing you do in placing the terrain is if you chose positional defense, you get to place a large hill in your deployment zone. And you can see on the diagram there the deployment zone for the defender is up to 18 inches from their baseline, and so you can place a large hill in that deployment zone. Then the defender places a straight road across the central sector, and that's necessary for so every game, every strategy that's played. There's always this road across the central sector, and it can be anywhere in the central sector. And those 2 pieces go down first. So you do these 2 things, and then you get into choosing the other optional pieces. So each player then chooses 2 of the compulsory features, starting with the defender. And then each player chooses 2 to 4 of the other optional features, again starting with the defender. And so under 3 and 4, all that terrain is chosen before you place any of that terrain on table. You then start placing the terrain, and again defender first. And the first thing that must go down, if anybody chose a river or a stream, that goes down first. You then alternately place your compulsory pieces, so the defender places one of theirs, the attacker places one of theirs, and so on. And then you place the optional pieces, and then finally roads go last. So you first have all the other terrain, and then the roads go down, and always defender first. Right, so now we've got the terrain, we know what our strategies are. How do we get going? So you place your LOCs, your lines of command, again defender first. These must touch a road and a player's rear edge. So in this example there's only 1 road on the table, so that you mandated where you have to place your LOC. You then, if any of you have chosen redoubts, you'd place redoubts at this point. They can be placed up to the halfway line, and if they've got they must have their defending unit in them at this point. You then record the arrival points of off-table troops, so these would be flank marchers, reserves, and reinforcements. Flank marchers can arrive in 4 places, so they can arrive on your left flank or your right flank, and on your half of the table or your opponent's half of the table. So you have to record one of those 4 options for each division that's coming on a flank march. In the case of reserves and reinforcements, they arrive on your baseline. So you've got 3 options there: left sector, central sector, or right sector. Now you get to deploying your units and commanders. The defender goes first, and you deploy by division. So the defender places their first division with its divisional commander, and then the attacker places their first division, and so on, until all on-table troops are down. The only exception is if the attacker chose frontal assault, then the attacker would start that sequence. Strong points are deployed before enemy units not in redoubts are deployed. So as you start you're placing your units, if you have chosen to put a unit or units in strong point, you'd have to put them down first. Conversely, reverse slope units are deployed after all enemy units are deployed. So reverse slope, as it implies, is hidden deployment, and to do this, units must have part of their base touching or on the hill, and they must be behind the crest, obviously, and behind that a line parallel with the base edge. So basically, you're hiding troops behind the hill, and they go down after all your opponent's troops are deployed, unless, if you recall, they chose probe, in which case you don't get that option. And then finally, if you chose prepared attack, artillery would now carry out that bombardment. You can see there they can be placed up to the halfway line. If you've placed them there and they're still out of range and or arc of enemy, you can actually move them and further 6 inches forward, so they can really get into the face of the enemy and carry out a good bombardment. Worth remembering though, you can't double move in your first turn if you've chosen this option. So you have to consider, can I get up to those guns to defend them, or have I left them too exposed? So again, pros and cons with every strategy. And finally, we're ready to start the game. So as I said up front, this sequence, it seems complex, but actually with an experienced players, you should be up and running within half an hour of arriving for your game. There's the attacker starts the first turn always. Some movement restrictions, so positional defense, as I said, can't move out of their deployment zone for the first 2 turns. Flexible defense for the first turn. Frontal assault, the attacker can't move backwards for the first turn. So you've kind of committed. So now we're playing the game, and there's a 6-step sequence for every turn. It is alternate moving, so the attacker starts first. You get the command point allocation phase, followed by the assault phase when you charge home. Then you get firing. Only after firing does movement come, which sometimes confuses people, but it's an important part of the sequence. You then fight the combats. You resolve the combats from the assault phase, would happen after movement. And then you have the recovery phase where things get rallied and generals move and so on. Through the series, I'll talk you through each of those 6 steps in a bit more detail. And then just so you know what you're aiming for, victory and defeat. So how does the game end? Each unit in your army is worth 2 army combat value, or ACV. So a 12-unit army has 24 ACV. You lose ACV depending from units that are broken, spent, or wavering. So 2 points for a broken unit, 1 for a wavering unit, and half a point for a spent unit. It's written there the wrong way around. Victory and defeat occurs when the ratio of your losses to your opponent goes above a certain level. So you can see on the table there, if you've lost 30% or more and your opponent has lost less than 10%, game is over, and so on. So 40% to you, your opponent has to have lost 30%. Otherwise, if they've lost less than 30, you've lost. If you've lost 50% and your opponent's lost less than 50, then you've lost. And finally, if you both lost 50%, which happens from time to time, basically both armies break and the game is a draw. So that's it for setting up the game and working out how to get your troops down and the terrain down. In our next episode of this series, we'll talk about commanders and command control.